Okay, now we're going to talk about the myth of the three-fifths compromise. This is a part of the Constitution that is frequently misunderstood. And in order to go ahead and explain it to you, I am enlisting the help of Tom Hanks. He has no idea that he's in my video, but who cares? He posted this online so I can use it however I want to. So what I want to do is I want you to go ahead and listen to the video. Now you can also, if you have your lecture notes in front of you, you can click on, you can watch the link yourself. You don't have to watch the whole thing, just the very first part, or just listen up and you'll hear me go ahead and I'll run it to the point that you need to listen to it. But this is about a part of the Constitution that when people talk about it, they frequently say that the Constitution indicated that black people were in fact three-fifths of a human being, right? Which is a pretty disgusting idea, right? Black people are not a full human being, they're three-fifths of a human being. Some of you may have heard of that before. Maybe you've heard that before. You've heard somebody say something like that. Maybe you heard it in high school. Okay, so here's the lesson for today. That's wrong. That's kind of, the interpretation is kind of dumb, okay? And so, you know, if you're thinking like, what do you mean that's dumb? Like calling black people three-fifths of a human being is dumb? So just listen, and then you'll follow along, and by the end, you'll understand what I mean, and then the next time you hear somebody say it, you'll go like, whoa, sit down. That's actually dumb. And I want you to keep in mind that not only do people say this, but I actually heard somebody in the House of Representatives, an elected official, say the same thing. So there are a lot of people who don't understand this. So let me go ahead and explain by going ahead and starting off and talking and using the words of none other than Tom Hanks. So here you go.
Hello, I'm Tom Hanks, and I want Barack Obama to be the next president of our country. Okay. As official celebrity, I know my endorsement has just made your mind up for you. History with a capital H is going to be made this November, no matter who the president-elect is. I want Barack Obama to be president of this country, a country that once said that people of his skin color were only three-fifths of a human being.
That's the operative sentence. Let me see if I can rewind that back a little bit.
People of his skin color were only three-fifths of a human being.
A country
that once said that people of his skin color were only three-fifths of a human being.
Okay. A country that once said that people of his skin color were only three-fifths of a human being. That's Tom Hanks' position. And again, other people as well. And again, you may have heard that too. So I want to go ahead and I want to explain to you why that is dumb. Okay? So if you look on your notes, I actually have the words of this portion of the Constitution written right on there. And I'm just going to read it, just so I've officially read it, and I know that you know it, and you've seen it before. But it says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service of terms, and excluding Indians not taxed three-fifths of all other persons. Okay, now if you're thinking like, Phil, I have no idea what that means. Don't feel bad, you're in good company. There's a lot of people who don't know what that means, and that sentence is sort of that old English sort of style of writing which makes everything more complicated than it needs to be. So let me break it down. If you look on your lecture notes, you'll see what I've basically done is broken down the meaning of that whole section into a math formula, because that's all that provision was. That part of the Constitution basically answered the question, okay, the House of Representatives is going to be based on population. Who do we count in the population? How do we count the population? Who is part of the population? Because there was a big debate, as you can probably imagine. Some states only wanted to count free people. Other states only wanted to count free people plus slaves when you're adding up the population. Well, if the House of Representatives is going to be based on population, the more people you have, the better, right? Because then you're going to have more representatives. It turns out that the states that had slaves wanted to count slaves as part of the population. The states that didn't have slaves didn't want to count slaves as part of the population. That was a big debate. And so the slave states went ahead and they, with the non-slave states, they came up with a compromise. And the 3/5 compromise is the compromise. So if you look at the formula, you'll see that it says basically the population of a state equals all the free people plus, and I'm just going to call it assorted others because there were people in prison, other things, but just assorted others plus 3/5 of all the slaves. That's where this whole 3/5 of a human being comes in. That's how they were going to add up the population. They were going to take all the free people plus this assorted group of people, Indians that pay taxes, people who are in prison, and then 3/5 of all the slaves. Okay, so that's where this whole thing, 3/5 of a human being, comes into play. So let's think about what Tom Hanks said. Tom Hanks said, in a country that once thought of people of his skin color as 3/5 of a human being. Well, obviously that sounds pretty disgusting. And it sounds to me like what Tom Hanks is saying is it would have been better if our Constitution thought of people of his skin color, black people, as a full human being. That would have been better. Instead, we count him as 3/5 of a human being, which is pretty awful. Or so Tom Hanks would like you to believe. Actually, Tom Hanks just has no idea what he's talking about. So I want you to look down on the notes. And I want you to imagine, we're going to talk about the logic of Tom Hanks. I want you to think about Tom Hanks. This idea that it was bad that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a human being. They should have been counted as a full human being. So let's go ahead and think about that. So suppose we have a state that has 100 free people and it has 100 slaves. Okay? 100 free people and 100 slaves. Now, according to Tom Hanks, the way he seems to be suggesting that we count the population, if you were going to, the Constitution was the way Tom Hanks wanted it to be, you would take those, you would count all the free people, you would count all the slaves, and the population would be 200 people. Right? What does the Constitution actually say? It says, okay, you count the 100 people and you count 3/5 of all the slaves, in which case the population is 160, right? Because you're not counting every slave as a full person, you're counting them as 3/5 of a person. Well, think about the House of Representatives now. In Tom Hanks' version, if you count all the slaves as a full human being, the way he puts it, the slaves, as a population, a state that has slaves, their population would be bigger. And because their population would be bigger, they would have more representatives. Now, mind you, if they have more representatives, those representatives aren't there to represent the slaves. They don't care about slaves. They're slaves. The Constitution, by counting slaves as 3/5 of a human being, reduced the power of the slave states. As a matter of fact, not only do I think it wouldn't have been a good idea to count slaves as a full human being, I think they should have been counted as 0. I don't think they should have been counted at all. That way, if you had a slave state that had 100 free people and 100 slaves, they would only be able to count their population as 100. And that way they would have less representation. Why should they get more representation? Because they have slaves, right? Why should they get more stuff? Because they have slaves. So the whole thinking is completely backwards. If it was up to the slave states, slaves would have counted as 10 people each. They would have counted slaves as 10 people. And then that way they would have way bigger populations and way more representation in the House of Representatives. The compromise essentially reduced the power of the slave states by, instead of counting the slaves as a full person, they count them as 3/5 of a person, and that brought down the population of the slave states, and therefore they had less representation. Tom Hanks doesn't even realize it, but he's basically arguing that the slave states should have had more representation in the House of Representatives. And I have a feeling, although it's not like we're friends and we hang out, if he knew that, he wouldn't have been saying the things he was saying. Okay? Now that doesn't make sense. Play it over one more time. Take a look at the formula. And if you don't get it, then be sure the next time we talk, to go ahead and ask questions about the 3/5 compromise, but we are finally done with lecture 2. And with that,